and oil refineries. And now there's a boom in natural gas, and so industry there is expanding. So are efforts to stop it. Here's Tegan Wendland of member station WWNO in New Orleans.
On a sunny Saturday morning, I meet Sharon Levine for a little tour of her neighborhood.
See, that's my son's house right there, Sharon.
Oh, great. She grew up here in rural Welcome, Louisiana, in St. James Parish along the Mississippi River, and most of her kids have stuck around, too. But now she's on a mission to stop a proposed chemical mega-complex less than a mile from her house. We drive just around a curve and see a big empty field where there's some construction underway. In the distance, there's a metal fence.
Can you see the gate back there, the fence back there? That silver thing is new. It's like an L shape.
That's where the graves are?
That's where the grave sites are.
There used to be a plantation here, so when the giant factory was approved, state archaeologists investigated the site and found graves of enslaved people. We stopped to look.
And I'm pretty sure a lot of us here have ancestors that are buried in that grave, in one of those grave sites.
Levine's hoping the historic graves will force the company, Formosa Petrochemical, to stop building. The Taiwanese company is one of the biggest plastic manufacturers in the world, and this is a good place to build. The river provides quick access to an international port, and the state offers tax breaks. It gave Formosa a $12 million grant. But Levine sees the plant as a threat to a place she loves.
My little morning coffee.
Back at her house, which she built on family land with her husband, she describes how the rich, fertile soil along the river made for great farming 50 years ago.
It was wonderful back then. Beautiful land and everything, nice. My daddy grew all of our vegetables and fruits.
They'd take the vegetables to New Orleans and sell them at the French market.
We had to get up early in the morning to go pick butter beans. I used to hate that.
Now her country home is surrounded by giant factories. There are more than 10 in St. James Parish. Their smokestacks forming huge clouds that cast shadows over miles. Levine thinks all of that industry is making her family and neighbors sick.
I feel like if the pollution don't stop, we're going to slowly die.
Her husband died of heart problems. Many of her neighbors have died of cancer. She says the air often smells bad. It's hard to link specific illnesses to certain pollutants, even though St. James Parish, where she lives, has an above-average rate of cancer for Louisiana, which has one of the highest rates of cancer in the country. According to an analysis by ProPublica, the Formosa complex would more than double toxic air emissions here. Levine organized her neighbors to fight the plant, forming a group called Rise St. James.
Not for profit! Not for profit!
Last fall, she marched with other environmental advocates all along the Mississippi River, up to the capital, Baton Rouge. They got lots of media coverage. They delivered their demands to lawmakers. No new development in the region. Matthew Block is Governor John Bel Edwards' chief counsel.
Well, obviously, the governor does not agree that there should be some moratorium on manufacturing facilities.
But his office did agree to do a small public health study. It'll survey people within a 1.5-mile radius around a single plant, 5 miles away from where Levine lives.
There's no question that this is a limited study. It doesn't pretend to be otherwise, but it's also a start in how we can start to look at these communities and whether or not there is or isn't a higher incidence of cancer, and then we can make decisions from there.
But the study won't look at future emissions from the Formosa plant or a handful of others being built. Advocates say it's the only public health study the state's ever done in the region, and that it's not enough. They accuse lawmakers of putting profit over people's lives. The plants have brought a lot of jobs and money, says economist Lauren Scott.
It's just like nothing I've ever seen before.
A spokesperson for Formosa Petrochemical says the new plants in Levine's neighborhood would create 1,200 new high-paying jobs. Scott says Louisiana competes with other places for these plants, and when communities like St. James push back, it's bad for business.
One thing we know for sure is the larger the pushback, the more expensive it is to locate here. And that's just one of the factors that has to be considered when figuring the rate of return on investment here versus Texas.
This tension between economic growth and health concerns has played out for years. Beverly Wright is the director of the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice and has advocated for people in the chemical corridor for more than 3 decades.
It's hard for me to stay calm about this.
She says they've won a few fights, stopping some plants from being built, getting relocation money for an entire community in one case. Yet since the 90s, more and more plants have been built.
I look at all of our work that we did. I mean, this was my life for years, and watching it just being washed away. And a lot of the people that we work with are dead and gone.
Now, Rise St. James is suing the U.S. Army Corps to stop the Formosa plant. They've appealed to the state to revoke the permit, and they're leveraging the historic grave sites as a reason the company shouldn't be allowed to build. Still, as much as it pains her, Wright says the best way for people in the region to protect their health may be to just move. Sitting at her kitchen table, Sharon Levine says she would never consider it.
We were here first. The chemical plants trying to invade our privacy and our property. Why don't they go somewhere and not come to us? This is our home. This is not their home.
She neatly packs up her flyers and the pecan clusters she made for a meeting tonight. She's organizing her neighbors to continue to fight the Formosa plant, even as construction is underway just down the road. For NPR News, I'm Tegan Wensland in St. James, Louisiana.
Context of White Supremacy. Gus T. Renegade in for another broadcast, hopefully to share constructive information on the system of white supremacy. Today's date, Thursday, March 12, 2020, so I have been told. This is our weekly book club. We are still reading Dr. Sylvia Hood Washington's Packing Them In, studying the history of environmental racism in the city of Chicago, Illinois. Our audio segment was not focused on Illinois. It was talking about Cancer Alley down in Louisiana. We have played a number of different reports talking about so-called Cancer Alley. I remember the New York Times, specifically Charles Blow, who's a black male. He does opinion pieces for the New York Times, often about racism. He did a segment on Cancer Alley in Louisiana, I believe in 2016. Have to check the dates to see if I'm accurate there, but it was in the last 4 years, talking about Cancer Alley. I think he even has family there, and I just saw that report this week, or just heard it. They just published that report this week, talking about the ongoing chemical and biological warfare against black people in that area. Some of our very listeners, Irie, callers no less, reside close to or in that region. Just a reminder, another bit of evidence that what we are reading about in Chicago is not strange, is not new, that is not an anomaly. This is just one component of the global system of white supremacy racism. Without further ado, we will get started. Context of White Supremacy. Again, this is Dr. Sylvia Hood Washington, Packing Them In, audio segment number 1.
The 1970s, Earth Day, and nascent environmental justice ideologies. The first National Earth Day observance on April 22, 1970, which sought to address the environmental problems of the planet as a result of man's actions and mentalities, inadvertently revealed today's environmental justice concerns. Although a national movement did not emerge in the 1970s to address the environmental inequities in poor and minority communities, the philosophical and ideological underpinnings for today's environmental justice movement had already emerged. Contrary to much of the published literature about the first Earth Day, African Americans and other communities of color had already begun an open dialogue about environmental justice issues. National and local articles that describe the reactions by African American communities and their leaders to the emerging environmental movement began appearing in newspapers and magazines during 1970 in light of the country's newfound concerns about the environment. Their concerns mirrored those expressed by Dr. King in 1968 and revolved around the need for sanitary housing, the need for environmental infrastructures, and the illegal dumping of waste and garbage in their communities. For instance, one day before Earth Day, the prominent black Chicago newspaper, the Chicago Defender, ran a photographic report about the visit of Special Presidential Assistant Robert J. Brown and his task force on aid to disadvantaged communities to the impoverished community of Robbins, Illinois. The report pointed out that this poor African American community was suffering from environmental health problems because of the inadequate sanitary infrastructure. The environmental problems were so severe that Robbins residents at this time were contracting hepatitis because of the high levels of sewage in the standing water. The recognition of the connection between poverty and environmental disenfranchisement was also reflected in the comments by another prominent civil rights activist during this time period, Reverend Jesse Jackson. During the first Earth Week, April 1970, Reverend Jackson, at the time still a member of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, and former director of Operation Breadbasket, went to Congress to discuss the country's continuing need to resolve the problems of the poor. Jackson urged the government to focus its concerns on the issue of hunger and sanitary housing and decried the attention that was being given to the emerging traditional environmental movement. Jackson felt that the newly emerging environmental movement was drawing attention and concerns away from the civil rights movement. Jackson's sentiments and posture towards the environmental movement and its relationship to African Americans was echoed across the country by many politicians, but especially by the country's first African American mayors, Carl B. Stokes of Cleveland and Richard Hatcher of Gary, Indiana. The observations of Mayor Stokes and Hatcher, elucidated in the Earth Day article, "To Blacks, Ecology is Irrelevant," in Business Week on November 14, 1970, centered on the fact that blacks were more likely than whites to suffer from environmental illnesses and that their environmental problems were symptomatic of deeper societal ills such as poverty, racism, and the inequitable distribution of political power. This same article also made it clear that blacks were very cognizant of their otherness as well as the environmental inequalities occurring in their communities, and that they resented bearing only the costs of modern industrialized societies without the concomitant benefits. The conclusions of Business Week would reflect the primary arguments of the modern environmental justice movement. Blacks are not opposed to cleaning up pollution. Environmental woes to black leaders are symptoms of a deeper disease-infected society, poverty, racism, and the inequitable distribution of political power. Blacks will not be satisfied by cleaner ghettos if they are still denied access to suburbia. They will not be appeased by a company that cleans up its shop if it still excludes blacks from its executive suite. They resent the ability of white America to mount a broad-based attack on pollution, like the Apollo Moon program, but unable to mount a similar attack on the related problems of poverty and race. Blacks are double victims. We suffer from pollution as much as anyone, but we're not beneficiaries of the effluent that produced the pollution. Factories that cannot be economically upgraded to meet pollution standards are being closed, often throwing blacks and low-income whites out of work. The environmental issue that most upsets part of the black community is population control, genocide. Too many whites see the population problem as too many blacks. Many birth control clinics are in or near black ghettos. At the same time, so many other vital community services are lacking. Black resentment is triggering a debate about priorities with the ecology movement. The earth and the web of life comes first, man comes second, versus the slums of Chicago must be cleaned up before the pollution in Lake Michigan. Environmentalists are recognizing that a movement dedicated to the survival of man and his habitat is itself ecologically unsound if it remains irrelevant to the needs of so many in squalor. Ironically, the nationally prominent African American magazine Ebony featured recently slain civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in its April 1970 issue. The majority of the magazine was dedicated to the accomplishments and issues of the civil rights movement, unemployment, housing, and education discrimination. The issue contained only one article that focused on public health issues as environmental issues in African American communities. Despite Ebony's limited coverage, the literature from African American periodicals at the time clearly shows that African Americans were cognizant of the environmental movement, but that they had their own interpretation of the critical environmental issues for their communities. The concerns of African Americans then and in today's environmental justice movement, however, seem to be with what they perceive as a shift to an ecocentric perspective, the environment without man, that they felt was eclipsing their basic needs for ensured survival in what they perceived as an indifferent or hostile human environment. An environmental justice consciousness had already emerged by the 1970s among African Americans, and on Earth Day 1970, African American Chicagoans actually had separate community-wide environmental celebrations. At the national level, African American politicians and periodicals emphasized that the environmental issues for African Americans were grounded in basic social justice issues like hunger, adequate housing, and safe water sources. By the end of the 1970s, a multiracial coalition of urban environmentalists began to focus attention on public health and working conditions and sought to reform the environmental movement to include issues of both race and class. By the late 1970s, Dr. Robert Bullard, a prominent environmental sociologist and key figure in the environmental justice movement, had studied land use in Houston, Texas, and found that garbage dumps had a disproportionate impact on people of color and low-income people because of their close proximity to these dumps. Earth Day had significance for many types of communities in the United States and served as an intellectual springboard that allowed communities to rethink human relationships with nature. The way in which people conceived of themselves with respect to this environment, however, was heavily influenced by their race during this period. African Americans, the ultimate others in American society, clearly felt that Earth Day observations could only be meaningful for them if they took into account that the integrity of the human environment on the most basic level was the primary environmental concern. They also clearly understood that the environmental integrity of one's ecological space was predicated and determined by race. This long-held view and stance would prove to be the basics of the 1980s environmental justice movement. The Urban Environment Conference. 6 years after the first Earth Day, the Urban Environment Conference, UEC, was developed in 1976 by a unique coalition of organizations, labor, environmental, and minority, dedicated to incorporating race and class issues into the environmental movement. This coalition initiated city care conferences that were held in cities across the United States. The conferences fostered the development of the ideological and structural foundations for the modern environmental justice movement. Contrary to prevailing environmental justice myths, the UEC's activities were supported by a traditional environmental movement organization. It received its first financial contributions from the Sierra Club and labor unions. When the UEC arrived in Michigan in 1976 for one of its first conferences, it brought together representatives from labor unions, environmental groups, economic justice organizations, and churches to discuss issues of economic justice and the urban environment. As a result of the Michigan Conference, the UEC received a $66,000 federal grant, which they used to fund 11 similar city care conferences throughout the United States. Federal agencies that helped fund conferences included the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, and the Departments of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, Interior, Energy, Agriculture, and Transportation. The UEC conferences and activities emanating from them led to the adoption of the first right to know legislation in Delaware. These right to know laws would become central to locally based environmental activism because future plans would be required to provide notice of potential environmental risks to the community. The knowledge of environmental risks gained by affected communities empowered urban environmental activists and laid the groundwork for research and documentation of environmental justice in the 1980s and 1990s. In 1979, the city of Detroit, the National Urban League, the Sierra Club, and the UEC held a major national conference that would come to have a major influence on the emergence and form of today's environmental justice movement. Together with approximately 75 national and community-based co-sponsoring organizations, 750 people met for 3.5 days to listen to addresses by community leaders, share information, and set new agendas for the UEC. Nearly all of the attendees were community activists familiar with the grassroots impacts of national problems. Issues addressed included public health, neighborhood empowerment, urban parks, suburban sprawl, and public transportation. 1978, Love Canal. As discussed above, poor minority communities are not the only groups of people who have been constructed as environmental others in America. Poor and working class whites have also been constructed as environmental others and have been, and still are, toxic victims, carrying the brunt of inequitable environmental costs. Like racial minorities, their environmental problems are inseparable from their economic conditions and their position as marginalized whites. Some scholars believe the modern environmental justice movement began at different points in the 1960s and 1970s, but there are many scholars who believe it began in the United States on August 2nd, 1978. This was the day when CBS and ABC television networks first carried news of the adverse effects of toxic waste on residents of Love Canal. The New York State Health Commissioner had recently announced that the landfill created by the Hooker Chemical Company had created a serious and extremely dangerous public health threat to the residents of Love Canal, a predominantly white working class community in Buffalo, New York. Hooker had dumped thousands of drums of toxic waste into an abandoned navigation canal that had been filled in 1952. The company then sold the land to the Niagara Falls Board of Education, who eventually built schools and housing. Soon after residents moved into the area, alarming health problems and birth defects began to occur. Adults, children, and animals received chemical burns from the dirt in backyards and school playgrounds. Citizens reported visual explosions. Hookers' dumping practices resulted in the resurfacing of pesticide residues and other chemicals that were seen bubbling on the ground. The community had become so poisoned that many of the residents' lawns would not grow, and the few fruits and vegetables that residents were able to grow made them sick. The grassroots environmental activism that is now so common and characteristic of the environmental justice movement was critical to the successful resolution of the environmental dilemmas at Love Canal. This activism was led and personified by Louis Gibbs, a Love Canal resident whose 3-year-old son, Michael, developed a respiratory illness that was tied to the toxic waste in the development. Moved by her own son's illness as well as the illnesses of many of her neighbors' children, Gibbs found the Love Canal Homeowners Association and took their complaint to the state capitol for resolution. The activism of the Homeowners Association led to a 1978 investigation by the state's epidemiologists. They found abnormally high rates of birth defects, miscarriages, epilepsy, liver abnormalities, rectal bleeding, and headaches. The continued activism of Gibbs and the Homeowners Association convinced the federal government that they should investigate as well. By 1980, federal investigations had identified 248 chemicals in the dump site. Currently, more than 400 have been found. As a result of the state and federal investigations, then President Jimmy Carter declared Love Canal, New York, a disaster area. Residents were evacuated. The state of New York purchased more than 230 of the residents' homes and financed some of the costs of their relocation, and many homes were torn down. As well, the declaration of Love Canal as a disaster area entitled residents to federal aid that could be used for relocation. Louis Gibbs' successful environmental activism to resolve environmental inequalities in her community would eventually be imitated across the country with various levels of success by other female environmental justice leaders like Peggy Shepard, co-founder of West Harlem Environmental Action Incorporated, We Act; Dolly Burwell, lead member of Warren County Concerned Citizens; Hazel Johnson, founder of Chicago's People for Community Recovery, PCR; Imelda West, co-founder of St. James Citizens for Jobs and the Environment; and Margaret Williams of Citizens Against Toxic Exposure, CATE. All of these women created or participated in the development of environmental justice organizations in poor and minority communities to address or combat environmental racism in their respective communities. The 1980s, environmental racism in Warren County, North Carolina. Today, environmental justice has become synonymous with the concept and phenomenon of environmental racism. Another turning point, and yet another candidate for the claim to the birth of the modern environmental justice movement, as well as the change in the conceptual premise from class-based to race-based, occurred in Warren County, North Carolina in 1982. African Americans mounted one of the first national protests over the sitting of a hazardous waste site in their community. Hunt's Dump was named for then Governor of North Carolina, James Hunt. After surveying 93 sites in 13 counties, Governor Hunt selected 142 acres of land in Afton, a small black community in Warren County, as the disposal site for 32,000 cubic yards of dirt contaminated with toxic polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs. The soil had been removed from 217 miles of North Carolina State Highway across 14 counties where it had been illegally dumped by the Robert Burns and Ward Transfer Company in 1978. The Burns and Ward Company had transported the waste from Buffalo, New York, and decided to dump it illegally along the highway rather than properly storing it in accordance with federal, state, and local regulations. The community had a high water table in porous sandy soil, and most of its residents got their water from wells. This clearly was not the optimal site for the land disposal of PCBs. The water table was only 5 to 10 feet beneath the surface. It would only be a matter of time before the well water was contaminated. Residents protested out of concern about the possible PCB contamination. Governor Hunt claimed his reasons for selecting Warren County as the disposal site were based solely on technical premises. This claim was later refuted by the chief of the EPA's Hazardous Waste Implementation Branch, William Sanjor. Sanjor, coincidentally, was a supporter of Warren County residents. His assessment determined that the sitting decision was political. Protests to put pressure on decision makers against locating the toxic dump in Warren County were then organized under the leadership of Afton residents Ken and Deborah Ferraccio. They organized the grassroots activist group Warren County Citizens Concerned About PCBs. Their protest actions were eventually joined by those of nationally prominent civil rights advocacy groups such as the United Church of Christ, UCC, Commission for Racial Justice, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, as well as religious leaders, environmental activists, and political officials. In 1982, Warren County residents peacefully protested the sitting of the landfill site for over 6 weeks and attempted to physically block the path of over 6,000 truckloads of PCB contaminated soil. Their actions caused Warren County to become a national news story. These peaceful protests resulted in the arrest of more than 500 people, including 2 civil rights activists who would prove instrumental and pivotal in the national recognition and future development of the environmental justice movement. District of Columbia Delegate Walter E. Fauntroy and Reverend Benjamin Chavis, then Executive Director of the UCC Commission for Racial Justice. The arrest of protesters, including Dr. Joseph Lowry of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, was the first time in American history that citizens had been sent to jail for trying to stop a toxic waste landfill. The 1982 protests by the Warren County Citizens Group ultimately did not prevent the siting of the landfill, but they did serve to make environmental racism a national concern. The actions of the Warren County protesters had a long-term impact on influencing future national environmental policies dealing with environmental inequities in communities of color. As environmental sociologist Robert Bullard noted, although the demonstrations in North Carolina were not successful in halting the landfill construction, the protests brought sharper focus to the convergence of civil rights and environmental rights and mobilized a nationally broad-based group to protest these inequities. Governor James Hunt eventually conceded to the Warren County residents and demands and agreed not to build additional landfills in their community. Further, he agreed to have their well water monitored for PCB contamination. The Warren County case makes it clear that the ultimate environmental others were people of color. Unlike the stereotypical images of urban and poor minorities suffering from environmental inequities, Afton was a stable minority community with a high home ownership rate. 84% of the residents in the areas surrounding the protest site were African Americans. 64% of these own their own homes. In 1983, 1 year after the Warren County protests, District of Columbia delegate Walter Fauntroy, who had been arrested in the Warren County protests, persuaded the U.S. General Accounting Office, GAO, to study the 1983 sightings of hazardous waste landfills in EPA Region 4. This region covered Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Tennessee. The resultant report, Siting of Hazardous Waste Landfill and Their Correlation with Racial and Economic Status of Surrounding Communities, concluded that African American people and ethnic minorities were more likely than the general population to live near a commercial waste treatment facility or uncontrolled waste site. The GAO study found that 3 out of every 4 landfills were located near predominantly minority communities. The report eventually spurred the 1987 UCC Commission for Racial Justice to sponsor a study, Toxic Waste and Race in the United States, a national report on the racial and socioeconomic characteristics of communities with hazardous waste sites. The commission employed Public Data Access, a New York-based research firm, to assist in the analysis of this information. The study concluded that race was the best predicator of hazardous waste site locations. Their statisticians found that there was only a 1 in 10,000 chance of such sitting patterns occurring randomly. Environmentalists studying incinerators found the same results. In response to the findings of the report, UCC leader Reverend Benjamin Chavis coined the term environmental racism to reflect the fact that toxic facilities were more likely to be found in communities with high percentages of racial minorities, the poor, the elderly, and the young. It would take more than 10 years after the GAO study before a national policy response would form to deal with the phenomenon of environmental racism. The changes in environmental regulation and enforcement policies under President Ronald Reagan, 1980 to 1988, undermined the fragile coalition that had formed between minority communities, labor, and environmental groups. These groups focused most on their efforts on their own constituencies and began to fight over whether federal funding and programmatic support remained during the 2 Reagan administrations and the single term of President George H.W. Bush. The 1990s, moving the modern environmental justice movement forward. In 1990, a group of academics convened at the University of Michigan's School of Natural Resources and Environment to discuss their most recent findings on the relationship between race and environmental hazards. The group would come to be known as the Michigan Group. This conference led to the formation of the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition. Prompted by their findings, the group wrote letters to Louis Sullivan, then Secretary of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and to William Riley, then head of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA. A meeting with Riley and 7 of the professors resulted in the creation of the Work Group on Environmental Equity. Its primary objective was to examine the EPA's negligence or insensitivity to issues of environmental racism. Also in 1990, environmental activists, disgusted by the policies and practices of traditional environmental groups, issued a public challenge to traditional environmentalists. Richard Moore of the C.O.W.S. Organizing Project and Pat Bryant of the Gulf Coast Tenants Organization, drafted a letter that was signed by more than 100 community leaders and sent it to the 10 largest traditional environmental groups. The letter accused the traditional environmental groups of racism in their hiring and policy development processes. It created a national media frenzy when an article appeared about it in the New York Times. The political stir caused by this event influenced UCC Commission for Racial Justice head Benjamin C.O.W.S, a signatory of the letter, to call for an emergency summit of environmental, civil rights, and community groups. The UCC spearheaded the planning of the summit under the direction of Charles Lee, the director of the Environmental Justice Program under the UCC Commission for Racial Justice. The summit took 18 months of planning by Lee, Pat Bryant, Moore, Dana Alston of the Panos Institute, Indian activist Donna Chavis of North Carolina, and academic Robert Bullard. The end result was the historic First National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit, held for 3 days in Washington, D.C. in October of 1991. It brought together 300 environmental justice activists as delegates and 400 observers from across the United States, as well as Africa and South America, who met to develop principles and issue a call for national and worldwide action. 3 basic philosophies emerged from the summit. First, that environmental justice is not separate from economic and political struggles in communities of color. Second, that environmental justice is intrinsically related to community empowerment. And third, that establishing a just environmental justice policy would be an exclusionary dialogue that recognizes that communities of color speak for themselves. More than 650 grassroots leaders adopted the Principles of Environmental Justice, a platform calling for an end to the discriminatory poisoning of low-income communities and people of color worldwide. The principles, see appendix at the end of this chapter, from the summit were eventually included in President Clinton's 1994 executive order on environmental justice. The summit concluded with a demand for a response from the EPA to address the summit's environmental justice concerns and the formation of 2 groups. The first group, the Indigenous Environmental Network, was formed to promote the interests of Native American activists. The second group, the Southern Organizing Committee, was formed to organize the Southern Community Labor Conference for Environmental Justice in New Orleans in 1992, a gathering of nearly 2,000 activists from 14 states. A few years later, 2 summit organizers, Benjamin C.O.W.S and Robert Bullard, were appointed to President-elect Clinton's transition team to help formulate national policies addressing environmental inequalities. On February 11, 1994, President Clinton signed Executive Order 12898 on environmental justice. The official title of the order was Federal Actions to Address Environmental Justice in Minority Populations and Low-Income Populations. The order forced on the environmental and human health conditions of people of color and low-income populations with the goal of achieving equal environmental protection for all communities, regardless of their race, income status, ethnicity, or culture. It directed all federal agencies with an environmental and public health mission to make environmental justice an integral part of their mission. The order also made federal agencies responsible for ensuring that states and organizations receiving federal monies for environmental projects did not violate federal civil rights laws. Finally, the order established the Interagency Working Group on Environmental Justice, with membership comprised of the heads of such federal agencies as the Department of Justice, Defense, Energy, Labor, Interior, Transportation, Agriculture, Housing and Urban Development, Commerce, and Health and Human Services, and the EPA. In 2003, 21 years after the modern environmental justice national protest in Warren County, 9 years after President Clinton's executive order, and a year after the second Environmental Justice Summit, the Warren County, North Carolina environmental justice issue was coming to a close. In 1998, the 60,000 tons of PCB contaminated soil was detoxified through a community-approved process known as base-catalyzed decomposition, BCD. The cost for decontamination was estimated at $16.2 million. The funding came from the North Carolina General Assembly, a settlement between the U.S. Department of Justice and the Burns and Ward Company, the source of the PCBs, and from monies from environmental projects that were completed under budget. 12 years had elapsed before the community was able to take steps to eliminate the hazards posed by the toxic waste in the landfills. In 1994, a working group consisting of members of the community and representatives of the state began an in-depth assessment of the landfill and a study of the feasibility of the detoxification. The Warren County story is one of the more positive in the vast repertoire of the communities who have waged battles in the modern environmental justice movement. There are now over 100 studies on environmental justice struggles. Many document an overriding number of unhappy or disappointing endings for environmental justice struggles. The struggles for environmental justice continues. Over 1,200 environmental justice activists from around the world attended the second Environmental Justice Summit in Washington, D.C. on October 28, 2002. Summit attendees included representatives from the United States, South Africa, Colombia, Nigeria, the Philippines, and the Marshall Islands. They all came to discuss the current and future state of environmental inequalities worldwide. A major conclusion that emerged from this second Environmental Justice Summit reflects the dismal state of affairs for the current environmental justice movement. Although improvements have been made in the way governments carry out environmental protection, gaps still exist. Summit attendees agreed that community groups today are still faced with rollbacks and the steady chipping away at civil liberties, basic civil and human rights, and environmental protection. Appendix 2.1. Environmental Justice Principles adopted Washington, D.C., October 1991. First National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. Preamble. We, the people of color, gather together at this multinational People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit to begin to build a national and international movement of all peoples of color to fight the destruction and taking of our lands and communities, do hereby reestablish our spiritual interdependence to the sacredness of our Mother Earth, to respect and celebrate each of our cultures, languages, and beliefs about the natural world and our role in healing ourselves, to ensure environmental justice, to promote economic alternatives which would contribute to the development of environmentally safe livelihoods, and to secure our political, economic, and cultural liberation that has been denied for over 500 years of colonization and oppression, resulting in the poisoning of our communities and lands and the genocide of our peoples, to do affirm and adopt these principles of environmental justice. Number 1, environmental justice affirms the sacredness of Mother Earth, ecological unity, and the interdependence of all species and the right to be free from ecological destruction. Number 2, environmental justice demands that public policy be based on mutual respect and justice for all people, free from any form of discrimination and bias. Number 3, environmental justice mandates the right to ethical balance and responsible use of land and renewable resources in the interests of a sustainable planet for humans and other living things. Number 4, environmental justice calls for universal protection from nuclear testing, extraction, production, and disposal of toxic, hazardous waste and poisons, and nuclear testing that threatens the fundamental right to clean air, land, water, and food. Number 5, environmental justice affirms the fundamental right to political, economic, cultural, and environmental self-determination for all people. Number 6, environmental justice demands the cessation of production of all toxins, hazardous waste, and radioactive materials, and that all past and current producers be held strictly accountable to the people for detoxification and the contaminant at the point of production. Number 7, environmental justice demands the right to participate as equal partners at every level of decision-making, including needs assessment, planning, implementation, enforcement, and evaluation. Number 8, environmental justice affirms the right of all workers to a safe and healthy work environment without being forced to choose between an unsafe livelihood and unemployment. It also affirms the right of those who work at home to be free from environmental hazards. Number 9, environmental justice protects the rights of victims of environmental injustices to receive full compensation and reparations for damages, as well as a quality health care. Number 10, environmental justice considers government acts of environmental injustices a violation of international law, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and the UN Convention on Genocide. Number 11, environmental justice must recognize a special legal and natural relationship of Native peoples in the U.S. government through treaties, agreements, compacts, and covenants affirming sovereignty and self-determination. Number 12, environmental justice affirms the need for urban and rural ecological policies to clean up and rebuild our cities and rural areas in balance with nature, honoring the cultural integrity of all our communities and providing fair access for all to the full range of resources. Number 13, environmental justice calls for the strict enforcement of principles of informed consent and a halt to the testing of experimental reproductive and medical procedures and vaccines on people of color. 14, environmental justice opposes the destructive operation of multinational corporations. 15, environmental justice opposes military occupation, repression, and exploitation of lands, peoples, and cultures, and other life forms. Number 16, environmental justice calls for the education of present and future generations, which emphasizes social and environmental issues based on our experience and an appreciation of our diverse culture and perspectives. 17, environmental justice requires that we, as individuals, make personal and consumer choices to consume as little of Mother Earth's resources and produce as little waste as possible, and make the conscious decision to challenge and reprioritize our lifestyles to ensure the health of the natural world for present and future generations.
Context of White Supremacy. Took me a moment. I was doing my Amazon shopping
the C.O.W.S book study session. That is our first audio segment. We will pick up the second audio segment. Will literally pick up on part 2 of the book. So it'll be a very easy transition for those of you who do have the book. If you don't, no problem. It'll say part 2 very loudly when we start the second audio segment. I will say quickly before we get to callers, other folks who dialed in, make sure I give the correct name here. Oops. There it is. The environmental justice principles that were adopted in Washington, D.C. C.O.W.S Yoga Retreat this summer, August 5 through the 9th. These were adopted October 1991, the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. And they gave their preamble with their different principles that they believe in. And that's why I started with the joke. I was doing my Amazon shopping. Racists, white supremacy culture, white culture is not about any of that. We are about consumption and terrorism and chemical and biological warfare. We are not fitting to do any of that, reduce waste, any of that. We are out here, even in the midst of Corona, we are out here getting my Amazon purchases on. Folks are still doing their mileage runs. I saw that this week where they were still doing flying hither and thither. Environmentalists, no less, were doing things. Hey, I got to get my miles in. I got to keep my, special frequent flyer benefits and all. It's worth it. Got to get my flight in, even if it's unnecessary. Doesn't matter about all that pollution, jet line fuel that gets, thrown out in the air. Frequent flyer miles, man. Have you been to the suite when you go to the airport? Man, free drinks. Have you been upgraded to first class? Anywho, before we get to actual callers, listeners who wrote in, untiljustice@gmail.com, untiljustice@gmail.com. If you have thoughts, observations, we will make sure to get them in as we read through the book. Listeners who wrote in, forgot one from last week. Listener wrote in, thoughts on the second reading. The first section of the reading provides evidence of the coordinated tactics of racist man and racist woman in order to segregate, quarantine, what a word use in this time period, black migrants. The tactics included policies of settlement, house officials, bombing of black properties, and demonizing of black migrants in the newspapers. So-called segregation, de jure laws created to promote segregation, as opposed to de facto segregation by custom, circumstance, personal choice, is a distinction without difference. In the global system, all actions are governed by one overriding principle, the law of white supremacy. Number 2, the author describes the efforts of Washington, DuBous as capitulation and impotent, and those of MLK as ineffectual in mitigating environmental racism. This statement struck me as both accurate, but at the same time somewhat victim-blaming. The people most to blame for establishing the foundation of environmental racism in the 20th and 21st century is racist man and racist woman and racist child. Number 3, the author was critical of Washington, DuBous, and others as the author described black leaders in a system of white supremacy. They lack power and should not be considered leaders, only spokespeople, as suggested by Neely Fuller. Enjoying the text, nice compliment to a terrible thing to waste. That is what I thought. Harriet A. Washington, the book that we read just before this, Test Your Water. All righty. So folks who dialed in, if you have observations, questions, thoughts, the number is 605-313-5164. The code 564943#. Press star 61 if you would like to participate. Test your water. Star 61 if you would like to participate. I'll make sure to give out the number again. We'll see if we have folks with observations they would like to share in the first audio segment here. Alrighty. Switchboard is not doing it. What is up with that? Let's see here. Did it work that time? Well, let's see if we get retired firefighter this time. We'll get it to work at some point, I reckon. Did it work that time? I think it worked that time. We got it that time. Retired firefighter, do you have commentary to share? You should be with us, sir.
Yes. Good read. I basically paid attention to the typical way that the racist white supremacists compartmentalize something to their benefit, which is the controlling company itself, where they profit off of its works, but don't suffer from the results. That is dutifully is earmarked for non-white people, as far as in their very close or in some cases immediate living conditions, which actually affects generations of people. I can recall mentioning a few weeks ago about the sweet smell of garbage that I was used to smelling every time I visited my grandmother on my mother's side. This huge smokestack, billowing smoke. And we're talking about, at that point in time, was in the 1960s. But, I mean, things haven't changed at all. Racist white man is going to have the desire to profit off of natural resources and their misuse, and it's done at the expense of the safety and health of other people that they generally classify as not being white, primarily. There are some cases, percentage-wise, they do play the percentages, where it may be a small percentage of some financially challenged white people who may suffer from it also, but it's primarily earmarked for non-white people. And in this part of the world, non-white black people for the most part. In the past as well as in the present. Not only, it reaches you through the air itself, on top of the ground and below the ground. And the reason why you keep mentioning about checking your water, also through your water source, which is probably the number one resource that is needed by the human body for people, is water, the replacement of water. And they basically have a very calculating, diabolical system, and it's global. And those are some of my thoughts on the first reading. Thank you.
Much obliged, retired firefighter in Florida. Great points. Water, very important. Make sure you are drinking your water. Test that water first, and then drink your water. I will get in, just returning to, they call it the First National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit, Preamble and Principles. I think also with these documents, if you don't have a means of enforcement, how you are going to make these companies not engage in chemical and biological warfare, how you're going to make white people bring you to the table, so-called, and make you a part of the decision-making process about what's going to be dumped where, and where these factories are going to be located, where this incinerator is going to be located. If you don't have the power to make all of those things possible, because those things do not exist. I don't think anything that is written out in this preamble as it relates to black people specifically, non-white people in general, anywhere in the world, I don't think exists 30 years after this. If you don't have a means of implementing, I do not see a whole lot of value in creating these type of lists. I see lots of these lists about, this is what we want, these are our demands, with no means of implementation at all. At all. Itemizing what's being done, very important, because a lot of people can be confused, and specifics, the particulars of what's happening, that is very important. But just, endless lists of demands, no. 605-313-5164, the code 564-943#. Press star 61 if you would like to participate. Thomas in New York, see, switchboard worked rapidly that time. Thomas in New York, if you have thoughts, observations, you should be with us.
Good evening, Gus. Good evening. Man, I'm dealing with environmentalism myself, man. Got 3 different floors in my building with people with the coronavirus. So, I hate, despise, and disdain the phrase "people of color." I hate that. I cringe every time I hear it. It's like, well, personally, I don't like all people of color, so it just doesn't. But either way, love canal. They said one of the symptoms was rectal bleeding, and they found over 400 different chemicals to this date. I believe it was Love Canal, New York. Rectal bleeding. I mean, what the heck was that? React. I see that in Harlem. I think I've been to that building before. It's like on 152nd in Amsterdam. But I never knew what they did, so now I know. I never, I saw people with the shirts, and I saw the sign and everything, and I never thought to ask, hey, what is that? I just, just another building, but now I see. Hunt's Dump, they said 142 acres of all black Afton, North Carolina, was dedicated to be a PCB waste dump site. And they said they had the PCP soil from not only the roads in North Carolina, but all the way from up in Buffalo, New York. It was like, man, talk about racism, white supremacy. Ooh, Buffalo, New York. After all the activism, even presidential legislation, they said it only cost them $16 million to clean the whole thing up. 16. They pay a brother with a jump shot more than that, like $16 million. That's all it costs to decompose the soil in a nice, safe way where you're not dumping it. Like, just, unbelievable how, they're not even really saving money. Like, it's just doing it deliberately, in my opinion. I believe the last book, it cost them $11 million to clean up all the lead somewhere. It was like, that was it. Not $11 billion, it was $11 million. This is only $16 million, and they could have decomposed of that stuff to start with in North Carolina. But that's why I would say it was done intentionally. It wasn't done for no other reason. That cost the company nothing. That's an insurance policy or something on their waste. I'll mute my line, Gus. Thank you.
Neely Fuller Jr., he regularly says a system of racism, white supremacy, white people, they could solve this problem today. This is not something, that would take 500 years, 1,000 years, 10 years. This problem could be vanquished right now. This is what they want. He said it took some time for him to grasp that that's what we are dealing with. And to get those type of examples repeatedly, because there certainly was one of those in, what did we just read? A Terrible Thing to Waste, Harriet A. Washington. I think it was Baltimore specifically that she, talked about the exact same thing, where it could have been We could have cleaned all this up for, $2 million, something small, relative to the health costs that are in the billions and all the rest of it. Like, we could have easily taken care of all of this, and the niggers could have had a nice, pristine little ghetto with no lead. Same thing for Flint. Like, lots of these examples. Like, this could have easily been taken care of. That is not what we want. Very important to understand that principle. Let's see. I'll double check switchboard as we continue. These chapters are a little awkward. Like, sometimes we'll read a book and one chapter will be substantially longer than the other, or a subsection, that sort of thing. That's kind of what we had this week. So the two audio segments are roughly the same size. The second section is a little longer than the first section, but, sometimes the chapters are not equal. Let's see. The first portion of our reading this week, so we're in chapter 2, and she was giving out her list of kind of these are some of the problems that black people see with so-called environmental racism, and they said that the environmental issue that most upsets part of the black community, so-called, is population control genocide. Too many whites see the population problem as too many blacks. I thought that was extremely important, that was apparently the viewpoint of not one or two black people, but a substantial number of black people. That was their conclusion. That was their assessment. That's what their brain computer was telling them, that individuals classified as white, they see the environmental problem as too many niggers. Thus, you just rewind to what we were just talking about. This is being done deliberately. Yes, chemical and biological warfare to make sure that we can get, or matter of fact, to make sure that we get rid of some of these niggers. Let's see. Anything else on the list here stood out? Many birth control clinics are in or near black ghettos. At the same time, so many other vital community services are lacking. Let's see. The slums of Chicago must be cleaned up before the pollution in Lake Michigan. Let's see. Yeah, some of these are the same sentiments that I said when we read Yurugu, how, for me particularly, to live in a city like Seattle, where they have hybrid buses, they have phenomenal public transportation and hybrid buses, so that you can have a depot and it doesn't have all those fumes and everything spewing out as bad as it would be in a Baltimore, an area with a lot of black people, and they've had hybrid electric buses for a long time. They even have a lot of underground subway depots, so that stuff is not being just spewed out directly into the atmosphere, and the light rail and all the rest of it that they have, and just being about, hey, refine, efficiency, let's be green, recycle. I said before, you can't even get a plastic straw in the city of Seattle, and much of the surrounding area. You can't even get a plastic straw. You can't even get a plastic bag at the grocery store. You can't even get a plastic utensil when you go out. I mean, that's how mindful they are about it. They could apply that same mindfulness to the system of white supremacy racism if they wanted, and or that could be applied in all cities. That's not what they do. If it's a substantial number of black people, it's not going to be that way. You'll just have lots of dollar stores and plastic bags everywhere. They say, this is still in chapter 2. At a national level, African-American politicians and periodicals emphasize that the environmental issues for African Americans were grounded in basic social justice issues like hunger, adequate housing, and safe water sources, which, in my view, all of that is environmental racism. We're talking about safe water. It does not get more fundamental and basic in terms of human rights, environmental justice, if you want to call it that, than water. Flint, Michigan. This was published way before that. Dr. Robert Bolivier, maybe we should get some of his literature in the library or on the program even, down in Houston especially. Let's see. Next page over. The UEC Urban Environment Conferences and activities emanating from them led to the adoption of the first right-to-know legislation in Delaware. These right-to-know laws would become central to locally based environmental activism because future plans would be required to provide notice of potential environmental risks to the community. The knowledge of environmental risks gained by affected community, empowered urban environmental activists and laid the groundwork for research and documentation of environmental justice in the 1980s and 90s. I think that is also important just because a lot of times you won't be informed. They're dumping waste from Buffalo down here in North Carolina, but you not find out about that until, 2-3 years down the road. They started doing this back when the Bills were in the Super Bowl. You're just finding out about it now. Like, man, what's been going on? They've been doing this for 30 years. What's been going on? Concealing information. We talk about that on the program all the time. Let's see. Speaking of dumping, she's talking about Love Canal, company that sold the land. Niagara Falls would be close there for Toronto. The company that sold the land, Niagara Falls Board of Education, who eventually built schools and housing. Soon after residents moved into the area, alarming health problems and birth defects began to occur. Adults, children, and animals received chemical burns from the dirt in the backyards and school playgrounds. I thought immediately like animals. Like they found out that some dogs got hurt. Oh, man. The heavens will fall. There will be smoke in the city. Ears perked to see what the compensation for the Love Canal situation is in terms of, how is that resolved? Did they pay off everybody, move the families out, pay everybody's medical bills? What did they do? And then compare that to situations like Cancer Alley and predicaments with black people. What happened, with the Hunt situation in North Carolina, just for comparison and contrast in terms of, because I know white people, they just like they harm white people in the system of white supremacy. I'm sure they toxify and pollute. They do that worldwide, so that's going to affect everybody. Compensation is going to look drastically different, I suspect. Let's see. Next. They said in the same area with the Love Canal situation, they couldn't grow food, and the food that they grew made them sick. Wow.
Lost my connection for a minute, had to reboot my computer, but...
You're still kind of distant.
All right, yeah, so 1980s environmental racism in Warren County.
Gus, you're still kind of distant in your application.
You don't sound crystal clear, sir.
Oh, can you hear me? You right?
You sound like you're all the way in Seattle, Gus.
Yeah, kind of distant.
Let's try that again.
Good.
All right. Woo. Yikes. Okay. I was going through my page thing and I got disconnected. So rebooted. Should be back now. I got disconnected with the 1980s environmental racism in Warren County, North Carolina. That was the section I was on at the point where I got disconnected. The community had a high water table in porous, sandy soil, and most of its residents got their water from wells. This clearly was not the optimal site for the land disposal of PCBs. The water table was only 5 to 10 feet beneath the surface. It would only be a matter of time before the well water was contaminated. Residents protested out of concern about possible PCB contamination. I thought this was important because it got raised. Well, this is the best site to place it. They said that was some of what Governor Hunt gave as justification, like, hey, this is the best site. We've looked at lots of different potential areas and places where we could dump this material, and this is the best site. The Negroes have got the best soil that, can house this stuff and it won't poison it. No. Might not have even done any studies, because sometimes they can lie and make it sound really nice. Talking about whites, they can lie and make it sound really nice. But no. Just niggers there, that's where we'll dump it at. Contaminate their well water? Great. Spectacular. Remember what I said, the black people, they have concluded. It seems like white people think the environmental problem is we got too many niggers. Let's see. Same subsection. This one I thought was really important as well. Now, she cites, I thought this might be worth another trip to the university library. She cites, the report eventually spurred the 1987 UCC Commission for Racial Justice to sponsor a study, Toxic Wastes and Race in the United States, a national report on the racial and socioeconomic characteristics of communities with hazardous waste sites. Behemoth title, worth it. And they come with, she says this is, the commission employed Public Data Access, a New York-based research firm, to assist in the analysis of this information. Stop right there. Now, I thought white people are ignorant about racism, white supremacy. Does it sound like they hired, Michael Brown Jr., Al Sharpton, Jesse Jackson, Eric Garner? This sound like they went and hired them, a bunch of black people, to come in. These could all be black people. I seriously doubt it. This sounds like some white people were probably involved in all of this. The other side of this is exactly who do we think the audience is for a report like this? Who do we think is going to be reading Toxic Wastes and Race in the United States? Eric Garner, does he have a subscription? Tawana Brawley, does she have a subscription to that? Because this came out in 1987. Eleanor Bumpers, that's who's going to have a subscription to this? I don't think so. White people are going to be the ones predominantly who are going to be involved in the publication, the research, getting funded for all of that, which is probably thousands of dollars, and then the people that are reading it. So it's both on concealing information, who has access to information, who gets all of this information, who's informed about racism, white supremacy, and I mean to the detailed levels, and then dissemination, who becomes the experts on all of this. It's not going to be, as she's been talking about, it's not going to be Dr. Bullard, who a lot of people probably have never even heard of, probably a lot of people who listen to this program, or it'll be the Greta Thunbergs. They grab some white 10-year-old out of a classroom and say that, oh, yeah, this is the expert. This is the person who knows about racism, white supremacy. Many different things. I thought that was so important. Not that there's, poor quality information. Like I said, I contemplated going to get it, but just you're not going to have a report like that that's probably got a lot of white involvement, white funding, and white readers and tell me that white people are ignorant about racism, white supremacy. On the same page, oh, this is important. She says the changes in environmental regulation and enforcement policies under President Ronald Reagan, 1983-88, undermined the fragile coalition that had been formed between minority communities, labor, and environmental groups. I thought there were a lot of different points in the book where she talks about people of color and poor white people, ethnic white people, or in this one, she doesn't even say white people. She just says a fragile coalition between minority communities, labor, and environmental groups. That's got to be, i.e., white people. In my view, that's like body politic in this book has been a code word for white people. This is too, and that's why I highlighted this. I feel like so frequently we're talking about racism, white supremacy, and we do not want to identify the problem, whites. I don't even know what we're talking about here. Labor, you're talking about individuals classified as white. This so-called fragile coalition of having a handful of individuals classified as white who are willing to come out and stomp around in the street with you and write out some worthless preambles about what should be done. We demand clean water, and we demand so-called fair housing and all the rest of it, and we'll get some cool T-shirts. They do that sort of thing with Michael Brown Jr., or whoever the latest black person to be shot and killed by enforcement officials. They'll go out. They probably did some of that in North Carolina this week, I think. They were doing that same type of thing in there. We'll burn the flag, That is not really solving any problems. certainly not the way that white people, when they get serious about getting things done, that's not how they behave. They get quiet. They sit down. They get that research firm in New York. We get out our, we get out our tablets. We get quiet, and we make a plan with a budget and a timetable about getting this accomplished. Let's see. Actually, I'll stop here just to double check, see if folks have any other comments that they want to make sure they submit. Test your water before we get into chapter 2. Let's see. All right. Other folks, if you dialed in, if we missed you totally, and you have comments, questions, observations to share, let's see. Will the switchboard work the first time? 3, yes, switchboard worked. Henry in Chicago, our dutiful professional narrator who's done all of the heavy lifting. Great job in doing difficult narration. Do you have any observations, comments to share, sir?
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
All right. Greetings, Gus. Greetings to all the callers and listeners. The narration this week got me. Technology kind of went haywire. I did 2 hours of dictation, and it was all lost, so I had to redo it again real quickly. But I love narration. It is difficult, though. But in regards to the reading, it was interesting how she put together this, the situation in Love Canal, and then right after that, the Warren County situation in North Carolina. And you notice how in the Love Canal situation, she mentioned on page 60 how the community was middle-class white people. And you saw that issue got resolved, I think, within the next year, where it says that residents were evacuated. The state of New York purchased more than 230 of the residents' homes and financed some of the cost of their relocation. So basically, they kind of, relocated these white people and kind of got them out of there and actually paid for their relocation costs. Now, going into the Warren County situation where it was predominantly non-white black people, if you look at the end of the chapter, they're talking about 21 years later is when this issue, and it wasn't like really resolved because, you had President Clinton signing an executive order about the environmental justice issues that was happening in there regarding the PCB contaminated soil. So it was, and then they spent the $16 million to decontaminate it. But it was 21 years later, and after protests, after filing lawsuits and doing all this, I mean, the Warren County situation just took forever and never really got a complete resolve. Like I said, $16 million just to decontaminate soil, but all the other damages, still remain. So, Love Canal, about a year. Warren County, 21 years, and still with a lot of unresolved issues. But that's the system for you. So that's all I have. I'll get my line.
Seems like that sort of thing could be done with, they could get federal assistance if they were really serious about it. Like, oh man, the folks like the situation in Flint, they wouldn't even have to move the people per se. They could just, hey, we're going to have bottled water. Everybody will get bottled water until this situation has been figured out. Like, you're not going to get Evian. We know how the coon thinks. Don't think you're going to, get over on us. But bottled water until everybody is certain. We couldn't even do something like so you don't have to go out in a car and drive to go get it and that. So no. We'll have it shipped to your house. Just basic compensation. I bet that bill would have been cheaper than moving everybody in the Love Canal situation. Nah. We don't want to do the correct thing. Wait a minute. Let's see. Caller on the Skype line, if you had questions, observations to share, let's see if the switchboard will cooperate again. All right, 2 times in a row. Switchboard cooperating? Yes. Caller on the Skype line, do you have comments, observations to share?
Hello, Gus, and hello to all of the callers. I was just piggybacking on what the caller just said about relocation. In Mr. Fuller's book, the code book, he talks about the difference between being relocated and being racially dislocated. And the previous caller gave an example of what relocation is. It's like you've been moved from an area, you know, in terms of it wasn't safe or there was something wrong with the environment, and then they were compensated. When you're racially dislocated, you don't receive accommodation. It's far as I'm concerned, gentrification is rape. Meaning of rape is mistreated and being carried away by force. Kidnapping, racial dislocations are forms of rape. So I just found it I found it really telling when the previous caller was talking about being relocated, and then if you're a non-white person, you get racial dislocation. And then I heard when you were talking about how non-white people refuse to see racism, white supremacy as it is. I guess because of the past 400 years, black men in the U.S. have been forced into passivity, cooperative submission to white men. I'm actually reading from Dr. Francis Quest Welsing's book on page 83 in the Keys to the Colors, ISIS Papers. Sorry about that, I didn't tell you first. The major strategy has been the installation of overwhelming fear. Specific tactics range from actual physical castration, lynching, to other overt or more subtle forms of abuse, violence, and cruelty. We should not be ashamed to recognize that these tactics used to oppress black men, it is the truth. It is reality. Ultimately, this is the meaning of black oppression. So the reason why I'm just reading that is just to emphasize, some of the reasons why sometimes non-white people refuse to see white supremacy, refuse to see the world as it is. Mr. Fuller is saying, what is the truth? The truth is that which is. So you can't run away the fact that we are living in a system of racism, and that the fact that we're mistreated in so many variety of ways, including environmental racism. And that's it for now. Thank you.
Much obliged. Does anybody have any other comments that they can get in about a minute or so before we get to the second audio segment?
Those list of items that they were requesting, which included end of occupations and all types of things. And it's like sometimes I You know, none of that stuff can be enforced. You know what I'm saying? It's just, to me, ridiculous to go to the United Nations for anything unless you think they're going to come here and do something.
I agree. They do these sort of reports on a pretty regular basis, different organizations, especially if white people are involved, and they'll spend a lot of time and money to create these reports. Sometimes they'll publish really glossy versions of them with, you know, high-resolution photographs, and sometimes you'll have to fly people in from different areas to do all of this, and there is no means of enforcement. White people with power, they don't just write these reports to sound cute. In fact, they might not even publish the report. It will just get done. I mean, in terms of the report will be published for the people who need to see that information to get things done. That is the difference when white people are serious about accomplishing things. They are not serious about replacing white supremacy with justice. They are dedicated to keeping that system in place. About 60 seconds. Anything else folks need to get in? Everybody satisfied? We will assume folks are grants from the first audio segment. Let's see. Double checking myself, make sure. Had to get President Clinton. He's been mentioned in so many of the books that we have read over the years in a variety of different ways. Like he came up in medical apartheid. He came up in Elizabeth and Hazel on the Little Rock Nine situation. Like it's probably even more than that if I had time to say. I know he's in Dreams from My Father with President Obama. He would have to be in there some way. Slick Willie, even here. It says February 11, 1994. Him signing the executive, this would be another one of those worthless type documents, Executive Order 12898 on environmental justice. The official title was the order was the federal actions to address environmental justice in minority populations and low-income populations. The order focused on the environmental and human health conditions of people of color and low-income populations with the goal of achieving equal environmental protection for all communities regardless of their race, income, status, ethnicity, or culture. And it has only gotten worse. That's what I mean about creating more and more and more of these documents and pieces of paper that are absolutely worthless. Just go about solving the problem and stop wasting paper. If you're not publishing these in 2020, then we don't need any more worthless PDFs either. We'll pause there. If you have additional thoughts, questions, Bill Clinton, then feel free. You can make a note, and we'll make sure to get to you once the second audio segment concludes. With that, so I said this is a super easy one because it starts on part 2 of the book. My condolences, I guess mildly, to our caller in Chicago, Henry in Chicago, for doing the narration. I have had that happen before when you're doing narration and something happens, it doesn't record, and you have to start all over again. Gnashing of teeth. A little bit of cursing, probably some name calling. I have been there myself. Narrating is hard work. Sylvia Hood Washington, Packing Them In, an Archaeology of the Modern Environmental Justice Movement. Actually, we're moving to chapter, or part 2 of the book now, so part 2 of Packing Them In. Dr. Sylvia Hood Washington, Context of White Supremacy, audio segment number 2.
Part 2, Packing Them In. Chapter 3, Justice in the Jungle, Immigrants and Environmental Racism in the Back of the Yards, 1880 to 1930. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Frederick Douglass. One of the first manifestations of environmental racism and one of the very first struggles for environmental justice in Chicago occurred at the turn of the 20th century in the notorious Back of the Yards neighborhood of Packingtown, located on the perimeter of the south side of Chicago. The communities that comprised Packingtown included areas now known as Bridgeport, McKinley Park, Back of the Yards, and Canaryville. Of these, only one was virtually undeveloped when Chicago's Union Stockyard first opened on Christmas Day, 1865, Back of the Yards. Originally part of the town of Lake, this community was sparsely settled prior to the Civil War. It eventually developed and grew along with the Union Stockyards. The remaining communities, while already firmly in place in 1865, continued to grow along with the stockyards. The stockyards have been in operation within the city limits of Chicago for a number of years, but had to be relocated primarily for environmental reasons tied to waste management practices of packing house industrial activities, environmental nuisances associated with cholera and typhoid fever epidemics in the city, and a desire to compete more effectively in the market, as well as the expansion of the railroad system, resulted in the creation of the Union Stockyards. Citizens complained about the environmental nuisances and public health threats led to city ordinances that helped force the packers to the outer perimeters of the city. When the Union Stockyards first opened on Christmas Day in 1865, 500 pens were used to house the animals. The pens covered 60 acres of ground. Within another 3 years, there were 2,300 pens on 100 acres, capable of handling 21,000 head of cattle, 75,000 hogs, 22,000 sheep, and 200 horses, all at the same time. Between 1870 and 1890, Chicago had begun to earn its reputation as the hog butcher of the world after the meatpacking industry grew by 900%. By 1900, meatpacking was Chicago's largest industrial employer, paying 10% of all Chicago wages and producing 1/3 of the manufactured goods. In a contemporary study, The Social Problem at the Chicago Stockyards, Charles J. Bushnell asserts in 1900, 225,000 of Chicago's population get their living directly from the business of the square mile occupied by her Union Stockyard, and another 225,000 get their living indirectly from the same source. Historical accounts written about the stockyards emphasize its incredible growth during the 35-year period from 1865 to 1900. When the Stockyard Company issued its 35th annual report in 1900, it reported that its 500-yard length, of which 420 were bricked and planked, had a livestock holding capacity of 75,000 cattle, 80,000 sheep, 300,000 hogs, and 6,000 horses. The report also described the immense infrastructures that had been built to support the hog capital of the world. By 1900, these infrastructures included 250 miles of railway tracks, 13,000 uncovered pens, and 8,500 double-decked or covered pens, connected by 25,000 gates. By 1900, more than 400 million head of livestock had been received and shipped in the past 35 years, and at a total valuation of more than $5,500,000,000. The organic waste from the killing of livestock was a major problem for the meatpacking industry and the public. If the meat could not be immediately consumed or preserved, the beef and pork went through a series of mutations that rendered them first unpalatable, then inedible, and finally dangerously toxic. The problem of overcoming the rapid decay of the slaughtered stock was particularly ameliorated by a number of technological and scientific developments occurring in the 1870s. The packers took advantage of the development of stationary refrigeration technology, as well as adopting the apert process of meat preservation on a large scale in tin cans through complete sterilization by thorough cooking and concentration on packing in airtight packages. Both of these developments enabled meats to be transported and held for an indefinite period in any climate, with or without cold storage. Although these technological developments were crucial in reducing the problem of rapid decay of marketable products, they did not address the problems stemming from the waste and offal generated during the packing process. The emergence of glue and fertilizer manufacturers in the latter part of the 19th century, who could utilize some of the waste and offal produced by the packers, started the packers on the path of byproduct utilization. According to Bushnell's study of the packing houses in 1900, a 1,500-pound steer generated 825 pounds of beef, and its remainders would be used to produce hairpins, buttons, yellowed persiate, fertilizer glue, gelatin, insaglass, neat's foot oil, tallow, grease, styrene, fertilizer, soapworks, and curled hairworks. Bushnell observed that the remaining blood and tankage and all waste of a nitrogenous and phosphoric character were made into fertilizer, albumin, stock, and poultry food. Other products were phosphoric acid, phosphorus, bone black, black pigment, sulfurate of ammonia, and bone oil. Although the packers made attempts to minimize the negative impacts of the environmental stemming from their operations by trying to utilize as much of the stock as possible for manufacture or production of byproducts, they ultimately lost the battle. As environmental historian William Cronin aptly noted in his work, Nature's Metropolis, whatever was left from the packing process sooner or later made its way as refuge into the Chicago River. The stench that hung over the South Branch and the filthy ice harvested from it were clear signs of its pollution. Decaying organic matter, whether in the form of packing waste, manure, or raw human sewage, was the chief water supply problem the city faced by mid-century. The infamous polluted natural environment of the back of the yards was directly tied to the enormous amount of waste that came from the rapid industrial growth in the Union stockyards. The level and nature of this waste became nationally renowned in 1906 with the publication of Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle. The dismal environmental state of both the built and natural environment was also tied to the expansion of the packing house industries and the inactions of the municipal government and the real estate interests. The pollution of the natural environment was created by the waste disposal practices of the industries and the failure of the city to enforce waste disposal laws and ordinances that regulated these activities for the sake of public health. The corruption of the built environments, in this case, overcrowded and dilapidated housing, was due to the city's failure to enforce housing codes that has been specifically designed to address these types of problems, but were being violated by slumlords. Humans, as well as animals designated for slaughter in Chicago stockyards, literally and figuratively found themselves packed into unsanitary spaces with severe consequences to public health. The water and streets of the back of the yards and packing towns were littered with the minimally controlled disposal of human and animal waste, blood, and feces generated by the rapidly expanding meatpacking industry and the thousands of immigrants working in that industry. This increase in population and industrial growth caused thousands of people to literally drop dead from sewage-related diseases such as erysipelas, typhoid, and cholera. The environmental history of the back of the yards is a classic story of environmental racism. Both the natural and built environment were allowed to become environmentally corrupted because of who was doing the polluting: politically empowered native white industrialists, and who lived adjacent to the polluting area, white Eastern European immigrants. The area had been allowed to become industrialized by the larger body politic to protect the native white Chicagoan population from known public health hazards associated with this particular type of industrial waste. These conditions were not allowed to persist or even exist in native white communities. This history is elucidated in greater detail in Chapter 4. Although there were no explicit legal policies or practices equivalent to race-based restrictive covenants or racial zoning laws that forced the immigrants into these spaces, the segregated geographical spaces that immigrants voluntarily created were disproportionately used as the final sink for the city of Chicago's waste, as well as that of the packers. By the turn of the 20th century, Eastern European immigrants dominated the back of the yards neighborhood. Harry Rosenberg's report on the 1904 packing industry and stockyards revealed that the older Irish and German immigrants and American residents of the packing town community had been replaced by Poles, Lithuanians, Bohemians, Slovenians, and Croatians. According to Rosenberg, the older residents had, since 1900, gradually moved away further south and to the boulevards and prairie, away from the stench and smoke of the yards. This assessment of the radical change in ethnic composition is supported by Robert A. Slayton's seminal study of Packingtown, Back of the Yards, The Making of the Local Democracy. Slayton's study found that by 1909, the percentage of stockyard workers who were of Slavic descent had increased to 46.4%, up from 14% in 1896. The 1920 U.S. Census revealed that this residential community was composed of 42.6% foreign-born residents. Of these, 44.6% were Polish, 15.9% were Czechoslovakian, including Slavics and Bohemians, 12.4% were Russian, 7.3% were German, 6.7% were Lithuanian, and 2.5% were Irish. The transition from a primarily Irish-German community to an Eastern European community started in mid-1880s when Polish workers were brought in as strikebreakers. Their numbers were exponentially increased between 1890 and 1900 by an influx of immigrants coming from the old country. Poles, the most dominant of the Eastern Europeans, were poorly paid day laborers who packed themselves into the cheapest places to live. Unfortunately, these cheap places were the places proximate to the most environmentally polluted sections of the area: packing houses, city dumps, stockyards, and railroad tracks. Like other immigrant communities across the country, Back of the Yards immigrants were accused of being and causing environmental or public health problems for the larger body politic. As late as 1952, historian Bertram B. Fowler stressed that the Eastern European immigrants in the Back of the Yards created the slums themselves by bringing the squalor and misery from their native Europe. According to Fowler, their degraded living environment could not be attributed to anything American. The squalor was that of poverty-stricken Europe. Native Chicagoans' environmental perceptions about immigrants were in line with national beliefs. According to historian Louise Carroll Wade, Eastern European immigrants in Packingtown were constantly portrayed negatively by the larger social body and the news media, which described them as living in indescribable filth or as depraved beasts and harpies. The national perception of immigrants as environmental threats is revealed by urban environmental historian Martin Malosi in The Sanitary City. According to Malosi, Boston's Lemieux Shattuck was an adamant nativist who firmly believed that the city of Boston's immigrants were the primary cause of its environmental woes. Malosi argues that Shattuck's report of the Sanitary Commission of Massachusetts, 1850, only reinforced the view that immigrants were primarily responsible for the degradation of the cities and the spread of disease. Public health historian Charles Rosen points out that Shattuck's report included explicit recommendations for how particular urban communities were to be disciplined and monitored to protect the larger body politic. These recommendations included sanitary surveys, vaccinations, and the establishment of state and local health boards. Immigration historian Alan Kraut's seminal work, Silent Travelers, demonstrated that during this period, immigrants were repelled because their very appearance suggested to their hosts' gazes a physical inferiority or vulnerability that might be contagious. Urban environmental historian Joel Tarr describes a Foucauldian separation of immigrants in the early environment in The Search for the Ultimate Sink. Tarr concludes that although the rapidly evolving city during this time period was divided into two parts, one for residential areas and the other for commercial industrial operations, this pattern of geographical separation did not hold for the vast majority of poor and working class immigrant communities. Tarr's research has shown that immigrant communities in this era found themselves living near the core of the central business district in highly congested living areas with problems of poor sanitation, high disease rate, and deteriorating housing. The spatial pattern of separation with concomitant environmental health impacts became worse with the rise of modern transportation systems such as the rapid mass transit systems and eventually the automobile. Neither form of transportation provided affordable for most immigrants during this time frame because they were restricted to the lowest paying jobs. The immigrants packed themselves into the urban and industrial core of the city and were literally and figuratively left to rot in the inner core of the polluted cities. As Tarr says, members of the middle and upper classes worry that congested living conditions, especially among the poor and the alien, pose a threat to the moral integrity and unity of the community. The stereotyping of immigrants as vectors of disease by the larger body politic played a major role in their being segregated in geographical spaces within the developing city. Rosenberg's 1904 report concluded that the infiltration of recent immigrants created urban congestion and highly desperate environmental health problems in an already environmentally compromised living space that had been produced by large garbage dumps, Bubbly Creek, a branch of the Chicago River, and smoke from the stockyards. According to Rosenberg's study, the death rate for immigrant babies was 5 times as large as the death rate on Lakeshore Drive. Recent research by Chicago's noted immigration and neighborhood historian Dominic Pasica has shown that Packingtown and the back of the yards was a classic Victorian slum with high rates of mortality among both children and adults. The built environment in the back of the yards. The environmental health problems of the back of the yard immigrant residents were exacerbated by a marginalized built environment composed of wooden houses on dirt streets that had no connection to the city's water system, no electricity, and few gas lights. Additional contemporary descriptions of the dismal built environment in Packingtown neighborhoods are found in Bushnell's contemporary monograph on the stockyards. He states that there was a drastic difference between the built environment of these white immigrant communities and the native white community of Hyde Park. He asserts that there were physical causes for the environmental disparity between the two communities and observed that the stockyard community was badly paved where there was any paving, most of it wood paving, which absorbed considerable impurities from air and drainage. In Hyde Park, most streets were paved with asphalt or macadam. In the Stockyard district, many of the streets are for miles in rainy weather, scarcely better than mud holes. Bushnell's description of the neighborhood is consistent with that of Upton Sinclair's in the infamous Jungle, a slightly veiled, fact-based fictional account of the lives of immigrant workers who lived around and worked in the stockyards. Although The Jungle is known for its detailed description of the workplace environment, it also contains passages that provide descriptions of the neighborhood environment. At one point in the novel, the main character, Jurgis, learns that his child, Antonis, has been drowned in a street that had turned into a canal after a heavy rain because of a lack of standard infrastructures such as sewers. Polluting the natural environment. Like most industrial areas, the Union stockyards used an accessible stream to dump industrial and organic waste from slaughtered animals. In this case, it was the southwest fork of the Chicago River, which became known as Bubbly Creek. Over 19 companies poured their waste into the creek. The inability of the organic waste dumped into the river by the packing industries to rapidly decay produced the Bubbly Creek. As a result of the decaying material that had sunk to the bottom, bubbles of gases were constantly being released. Local legend claims that the diameter of these bubbles had to be measured in feet. One eruption was said to have encircled a boat. In calmer moments, residents recall bubbles 5 to 8 inches across. They remember workmen on a small barge skimming the slime off the surface and collecting it in 50-gallon drums. The water was so dense that Bubbly Creek never froze. Bubbly Creek became a metaphor for the horrific corruption of the natural environment in the back of the yards, produced primarily by the stockyard industries. The eutrophic creek became one of the most identifiable landmarks in the community. Bubbly Creek produced a sanitary nightmare that killed thousands of people for years in the Chicago metropolitan area prior to the creation of the Metropolitan Sanitary District in 1889. Bubbly Creek is described in William Cronin's Nature's Metropolis as a great open sewer 100 or 2 feet wide, in which grease and chemicals underwent all sorts of transformations. It was in constant motion, as if huge fish were feeding in it or great leviathans were disporting themselves into its depths. The environmental state of Bubbly Creek worsened after the flow of the Chicago River was reversed from north to south in an attempt to reduce and eliminate the discharge of sewage into Lake Michigan that had created numerous typhoid fever and cholera outbreaks. Thomas J. Leblonsky points out that after this reversal, the river, Bubbly Creek, at this point still had a weak current, but it could not flush the stream clean of pollutants dumped into it by rendering and packing companies. Contemporary technical reports describing the parameters used to determine the degree of pollution entering the Chicago River reveal that the pollutants from the packing houses range from a minimum of 2.5 times for ammonium nitrogen to almost 25 times for chlorine that of the residential sewage from the 39th Street station. Reversing the flow of the Chicago River was one means of increasing the kinetic energy of Bubbly Creek and, hence, its potential to successfully manage the sewage problem. But it didn't work. An article appearing in the Chicago Tribune on October 27, 1909, sarcastically declared that the river's reversal was successful indeed, except for Bubbly Creek. There, the flow of the river, which had always been sluggish, practically stopped with the reversal of the flow in the river's main channel. Bubbly Creek became a practically stagnant pool. The refuse poured into it was not carried away. It putrefied and filled in a bed of the river at the rate of almost half a foot a year from 1895 to 1908. It created a scum on the water's surface through which the putrescent gases forming below with difficulty found their way to give the creek its name. Bushnell's contemporary description noted that the south branch of the Chicago River, just north and northwest of the stockyards, had become so polluted that small animal and fowls make their way across the river upon its coating of filth and grease. The creation of the sanitary district did, on average, ameliorate the environmental and subsequent health problems of the metropolitan region connected to the polluted waters of the area. But it also created an environmental nightmare for poor and working class immigrants who were constricted to living in the back of the yards. From an environmental perspective, the compromised living conditions would have to wait almost 40 years from the district's implementation for a resolution. The solid waste generated in Packingtown and the stockyards that was not dumped into the waterways made its way to dumps located in the yard. A large dump for the stable's waste was connected directly to the yards and located in its most southern part. Solid waste pollution occurring in Packingtown was caused not only by the packers, but also by the city of Chicago. The city's contribution to the blighted landscape was its operation for 4 huge holes into which Chicago dumped its garbage from a half a dozen South Side wards. Unfortunately, the immigrants living in the back of the yards had an alderman living in the community who contributed to the environmental devastation of the neighborhoods. Thomas Carey had originally mined the land for clay and processed the material at his on-site brickyard located in the community. Over time, 4 pits were excavated. One hole, west of Leavitt Street tracks, was completely filled by 1909. The other 3 holes, of 5, 6, and 10 acres, were east of the tracks from 41st to 47th Streets. The packing houses used one of these dumps to burn waste, and a fire smolted continuously, surrounded by a pool of fetid water. After the notoriety of The Jungle in 1906, newspaper articles that described the environmental inequities in the back of the yards began to appear in the mainstream native white newspapers. In late October 1909, 2 articles were printed in the Chicago Tribune that addressed the problem. The first article, Southside Dump Menace to City, Garbage Exudes Poisonous Fumes, is charge of settlement workers, dealt with the impact of solid waste pollution in Packingtown. The objective of the article was to report the concerns and accusations of charitable and settlement organizations of the 29th Ward, who had formed an investigating committee consisting of the workers from the University of Chicago settlement at the 47th and Robie Streets and representatives of the South Side Settlement League. The investigating committee, along with a representative of the Tribune, a sanitary expert and bacteriologist, had the preceding day visited the garbage depository. According to the article, their goal was to lodge complaints before the proper authorities based on facts and figures secured. This article was accompanied by a nearly full-page spread of pictures of immigrant children playing and women scavenging in the neighborhood dumps with captions that declared that the existence of the dumps was contributing to the death and disease in Packingtown. The second article, which appeared 2 days after the first, addressed the health problems in the community that were connected to water pollution in the area. This article, Fight Dump to Save Babies, Investigators Find Bubbly Creek Worst Disease Breeder, Death Rate is Increased, City Asked to Bar All But Dry Garbage in 47th Street Ditch, reported that Bubbly Creek had now fallen under the ban of the Volunteer Babies Protection Agency after a committee of the organization had visited sections of the stagnant stream lying within residents' district west of the stockyards. This article claimed that 127 babies under 2 years old had died in the 39th ward in the previous 6 months, and that half of them had lived within 3 blocks of the dump. The residents in the back of the yards continued their demands for environmental justice, even though their petitions, received by the city council and the health department, were quietly filed away, and officials claimed that closing the back of the yards dump would only transfer the nuisance somewhere else. The article then went on to state that the sewage-filled, slime-coated ditch was found to be in a condition more detrimental to health than ever before, according to physicians and sanitary experts, and was charged with direct responsibility for an unprecedented amount of sicknesses and an abnormal death rate among children. The article also quoted Dr. Caroline Hedger, a female doctor and former resident of the University of Chicago's settlement, who stated the poor health of these children was directly traceable to bad sanitary conditions, both along Bubbly Creek and surrounding the dump at 47th and Roby Streets. Mary McDowell, a resident and director of the neighborhood's University of Chicago settlement house located in the back of the yards, also asserted that there was a direct relationship to the community's health conditions and the environmental state of the neighborhood. In her essay, Municipal Housekeeping Symposium, she observed the death rate for children of that district was greater than that of the city as a whole and double that of the Lakeshore wards, who were innocently sending garbage from their neat backyards to the dumps on Lincoln Street. In this same essay, McDowell indicates that the problems in the neighborhood were so atrociously persistent that the City Waste Committee of the Women's City Club for 5 years had regularly urged upon the Health Committee and the Finance Committee of the City Council the appointment of a commission to study the whole question and report on a citywide plan for the scientific disposal of garbage. According to McDowell, these women knew that every day 534 tons of pure garbage must be disposed of and 172 tons of rubbish must be carried from backyards and alleys. These women felt that the garbage problem was not only one of aesthetics, but also a problem of sanitation and health. Although historians Louis Kane and Louise Carroll Wade have developed environmental histories of Chicago's early water pollution problems, the following observation by Mary McDowell offers the best explanation of the environmental inequities that caused Bubbly Creek and made it a dangerous nuisance to the neighborhood of Packingtown. This creek, once an innocent little stream with willows and wildflowers along its banks, had been turned into a cesspool. For 50 years, public indifference had permitted human sewage from over 1 million population, as well as geese, hare, and other noxious ingredients from the many Packingtown and stockyards within 1 square mile between Ashland on the west and Halsted on the east, 47th on the south, and Bubbly Creek on the north, to pour into this little stream. Environmental justice struggles in the jungle. When immigrants complained about odors and public health problems they believed were tied to the environmental pollution to their community, they frequently encountered indifference and inaction from the municipal government responsible for ameliorating these problems. Recognizing the nature and extent of environmental inequities taking place in their communities, immigrants, primarily women, spoke out. With the cooperation and support of non-immigrant settlement workers, social workers, and physicians, these women launched one of the first environmental justice struggles in Chicago's progressive era. Their early activism was undoubtedly motivated by high infant mortalities and illnesses in the back of the yards, which the women believed were tied to the environmental conditions that had been observed since the mid-1880s. At that time, the infant mortality for the German parish of St. Augustine's, which had a large immigrant population, was 141.95 per 1,000. Preschool deaths averaged 87.23 per 1,000, and deaths of school-age children 13.43 per 1,000, resulting in 3 out of every 20 children dying in the parish. The environmental conditions in the area were lethal to children. According to one study, by 1900, the back of the yard's child mortality rate was 40 per 1,000, compared to half that rate in more affluent Hyde Park. Even as overall infant mortality decreased in Chicago from 1928 to 1933, the infant mortality rate in the back of the yard actually rose. These white immigrant women and their native white women political allies used the same type of strategies that are still in use today to bring attention and to ameliorate environmental inequities that have impacts on children. They organize grassroots groups in their neighborhoods to protest pollution, and they conduct letter-writing campaigns aimed at local politicians to elucidate these concerns. These activist women garnered the attention and occasional support of the media, politicians, and academic and medical institutions to address the environmental problems that plague their communities. The primary champion for these primarily Eastern European and Catholic immigrant women who obtained some initial measure of environmental equity was a native white woman and neighbor, Mary McDowell. At its peak, the University of Chicago Settlement House, located in the back of the yards, had a parlor room, dining facility, a library and office, meeting rooms, and quarters for 17 residents. It had been formed to provide support to the immigrant community by offering kindergarten classes, day nurseries, a mother's club, music and drama classes, and English and citizen classes for immigrants. The majority of the back of the yards immigrants were Eastern European Catholics whose religious leadership wielded a strong influence upon them. Research by historian Robert Slayton revealed that parish priests in the back of the yards were vehemently opposed to McDowell's settlement house and strongly discouraged parishioners' involvement with the settlement house Protestants. Despite the objection of the religious patriarchy, Catholic and female immigrant parishioners still turned to McDowell, a disenfranchised native white Protestant woman, to help resolve their environmental problems. These immigrants knew that they were outside the pale of native politics, which were dominated by Protestant politicians and religious institutions. They were highly unlikely to be in the right place at the right time to influence environmental politics. They consciously chose to align themselves with someone who can fight on their behalf to bring about environmental changes. Mary McDowell was the oldest of 6 children. Born to Malcolm McDowell and Jane Gordon McDowell in Cincinnati, Ohio on November 30th, 1854. She was born into a middle-class native white Methodist family. Her father was a sheet iron manufacturer who worked in his own company, the McDowell Steel Company, until the mid-1880s. Her maternal grandfather was an early steamboat builder. Her paternal uncle, Irvin McDowell, was a brigadier general for the Union Army in the Civil War. McDowell's dedication to supporting others came honestly. During Mary McDowell's youth, her mother engaged in charitable works for the families of Union soldiers, while her father was dedicated to the abolition of slavery. Although her mother was a graduate of Wesleyan Female College in Cincinnati, McDowell decided at age 11 not to pursue a formal education, but instead to follow her father into a Methodist chapel which emphasized good works. McDowell came to Chicago in 1870 with her parents. By the early 1880s, the family had permanently relocated to the Chicago suburb of Evanston. Both Mary and her father commuted into Chicago after their move to Evanston to support volunteers in socially oriented civic organizations. Mary worked closely with her father in the Methodist Church, doing charitable works for the poor and needy. These works included helping refugees of the Great Fire of 1871. By the time she had formed the University of Chicago Settlement House in 1894, she had met and befriended Jane Addams in 1891 and served as Addams' kindergarten teacher at Hull House. By the time she opened the doors of the University of Chicago Settlement House, McDowell was an experienced community organizer. In the early 1880s, after hearing the corresponding secretary of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU, Frances E. Willard, at a speaking engagement, McDowell joined the organization and began organizing women in Illinois. By 1887, she was the national director for this work. In the same year that she opened the University of Chicago Settlement House, 1894, she helped found the Chicago Federation of Settlements. From 1914 to 1915, she served as president of the National Foundation of Settlements, an organization that had patterned itself after the Chicago Federation of Settlements. McDowell served as director of the University of Chicago Settlement House until 1923, when she became Chicago's Commissioner of Public Works. In the early spring of 1900, within 6 years of starting the Settlement House, McDowell attended a City Council Finance Committee meeting to morally support a confrontation between working-class immigrant men and a young aristocratic attorney representing the Chicago Reduction Company, which wanted to do business in the immigrants' ward. The immigrants lived in Packingtown and gave up a day's wages to attend a hearing on the question of abating one of the nuisances in their district that had been produced by a garbage reduction facility. According to McDowell, the lawyer ended up pleading for the nuisances that these citizens were protesting against. With calm assurance, he addressed the committee of the aldermen, gentlemen of the finance committee. I am sure you must realize that in all great cities, there must be a place segregated for unpleasant things. And of course, the people living there are not very sensitive. McDowell's paper revealed that the reduction company lost its plea for business because the people living in the district, segregated for unpleasant things, were in fact very sensitive to their living environment and were fed up with it. For years, these immigrants had been assaulted by the pollution of the open cesspool Bubbly Creek, bad odor, gases, and smoke. Fed up with their environmental situation, they organized themselves with the support of McDowell to combat the polluters in their communities. In 1905, immigrant women in the back of the yards were still upset about the environmental problems that continued to plague their community. They convinced McDowell to go to City Hall with them to complain to the Commissioner of Health about the public health problems that stem from the pollution. According to McDowell's papers, the city proved unresponsive because of the Commissioner of Health sent the women to the new Commissioner of Public Works, who told the outraged householders and mothers that they could do nothing to change the method of garbage disposal as they, the city, had no appropriation. McDowell eventually became the environmental spokesperson for Packingtown because of the power relations that existed between immigrants and natives and between women and men. Although McDowell was a woman, she was still part of the native white community as well as an active social member and community leader of the Protestant-dominant power elite. Her settlement house received funding from the very rich, the bankers and business leaders in faraway North Shore suburbs like Evanston and Winnetka, and some of the Swift and Armour clans themselves, the hated overlords of the packing plants. Mary McDowell would reflect that she became spokesperson because I was the only one of mostly immigrant women, who can speak to Chicago. This decision to speak out against the environmental inequalities in the back of the yards, as well as her active political and civic involvement in the city, was typical of many of her contemporaries who were also involved in settlement work. These settlement workers, together with their allies, moved in on City Hall to demand massive and often coordinated efforts from the city fathers. They pleaded for better streets, regular garbage collection, more efficient sewage systems, and programs of public health and sanitation. McDowell felt that the aim of the settlement was explicitly political, to initiate movements for citywide reforms in cooperation with city organizations to prove to the community that their civic needs and then help to supply those needs. By all historical accounts, Mary McDowell can justifiably lay claim to being the grandmother of the environmental justice movement in Chicago. She personally and professionally championed the environmental plight of immigrants and African Americans in the city until she died on October 14, 1936. The majority of historical evidence about immigrant struggles for environmental justice in the back of the yards is documented in her personal papers. In her 1914 essay, Civic Experiences, McDowell recalled that one immigrant woman in the area asked her a question that struck at the heart of the back of the yard's environmental inequities. Why don't they dump the garbage on the boulevards? Why do they bring it near our homes? This question wasn't an isolated one. According to McDowell, another Bohemian immigrant woman, together with several other householders, came to see her at the settlement house within a few years of its formation to complain not only of the dumps, but the uncovered wagons reeking with filth and flies. Before the end of the first decade of the 20th century, several environmental groups formed in the back of the yards to combat environmental problems. The Young Citizens Club was composed of boys organized by the settlement house's female university volunteers. The Neighborhood Guild was made up of both adult men and women. Cleaner clubs were made up of immigrant children from the settlement's Seward Vacation School, and the Settlement Women's Club was composed of first-generation women. As early as 1896, Cleaner Club's children went through the neighborhood to record environmental complaints and log them with the City Hall. The Settlement Women's Club's environmental activities focused on the physical cleanup of the community rather on complaints. These women inspected and cleaned up the alleys and sidewalks in the back of the yards. It was members of this club that routed the last hair field near Ashland Avenue, where one packing firm still dried the hair on animals on the vacant land nearby. The back of the yards residents, concerned about their environmental issues, developed cleanup jingles and creeds, passed out complaint cards, and inspected alleys as a means of motivating their neighbors and themselves to stay focused on and committed to cleaning up their geographical space. The most effective and complex of these organizations was the community-based Neighborhood Guild, which served as a clearinghouse for environmental problems arising from industrial and municipal mismanagement. The Guild became a Bureau of Environmental Complaints. One of their first activities centered around closing down the glue factory located near the settlement house on Gross Avenue. Immigrant women, especially householders, felt the factory was a threat to the community's health because of a standing water and fumes produced by the plant's operation. Acting on behalf of the back of the yards community, the Guild lodged several complaints with City Hall against the glue factory and eventually succeeded in having the operating practices modified. Mary McDowell points out that after much pressure, the glue works was compelled to save water by using a tank on top of the factory instead of in the holes in vacant lots, and one bad odor was abated. The tank is looked upon to with respect as the first monument to the first civic victory of a handful of awakened citizens. The guild also complained of scum-covered ditches where one little child lost its life when it tried to walk on the crust of filth, a possible reference to Bubbly Creek. They reported houses without sewer connections and the bad lighting on Gross Avenue. One of the most significant impacts the Guild had on the community was promoting and developing environmental awareness and activism. One practical result of the Guild's education work was expressed by an intelligent working man member who said, "I learned that I had a right to complain of bad conditions to the city hall, and I had my eyes open to see what before I never noticed, scum on ditches and dirt on streets." McDowell states that in another one of the environmental battles between Back of the Yards residents and City Hall, the residents had found the worst tenant houses in the neighborhood and reported it to the health department. The boss of the health department was discovered to be the owner, and the city inspector laughed at us for being so fastidious, for he said, "What's one more smell out here anyway?" McDowell's efforts to help get rid of the dumps or bring them under control were also met with strong resistance from city politicians who sought to protect one of their own. As discussed above, Alderman Thomas Carey was initially a resident of Packingtown who also owned a business there. But when he moved from Packingtown area to a classier neighborhood near the lakefront, his initial defense that it wasn't a bad environmental situation because he too lived in the area broke down. This reaction was typical of those in power to the environmentally disenfranchised living in Packingtown.
Packingtown, Illinois. Context of White Supremacy. So we'll pick up next week the subsection Gender, Technology, and Environmental Justice. That'll be for next Thursday. With all of this about the slaughterhouses and the filth from the animals and what have you, the beef industry in Chicago, I felt I would be remiss if I didn't say the C.O.W.S Counter-Racist Yoga Retreat. Plant-based meals. No need to slaughter hogs, cows, chickens. Get rid of all of that blood, waste, massacre of animals. Don't have all of that, the feces from the animal. Plant-based meals for the entire retreat. No starving, will eat well and not contribute to all of that foulness. Even though we're reading about Chicago right now where they talked about slaughtering hogs, that is North Carolina right now. Think about that the next time for those of you out there who love some crispy bacon. Think about the folks in North Carolina suffering, black people specifically in North Carolina suffering for that crispy bacon. But yes, plant-based meals, yoga every day. C.O.W.S Counter-Racist Yoga Retreat, all sold out for Toronto, but coming to Washington, D.C. this summer, August 5th through the 9th. Number to dial in if you have observations, thoughts, questions on the second audio segment, 605-313-5164, the code 564-943 pound. Press star 61 if you would like to participate. All the folks who dialed in with a hand up during the first audio segment should be with us. Our Skype caller, Henry in Chicago, our narrator, Thomas in New York, retired firefighter. If you are listening in and have thoughts, observations, and have not been able to share yet and think you might want to participate, go ahead and get your hand up. We have less than 30 minutes remaining in the broadcast. Folks who dialed in, thoughts, observations on the second portion of the reading. while folks are getting their thoughts together, I thought it was significant in talking about environmental racism. I didn't know a whole lot about Chicago's history of environmental racism and fighting back and all that. I was not familiar about that at all, so most of this book, I'm learning it for the first time. I had no idea who Mary McDowell was, had never heard her name before and reading this book or anything. So we get to this week's section, and before she identifies her as a white woman, it's like, oh, is this a black female? Like, wow, that, interesting to learn about. And I found out this is a white woman. It's like, oh, okay, this is similar to some of the things that I've seen before where, white women, even in an era, we're talking at a time period where they say, wow, sexism and all that really dominated. White women are not out working and running for president and all this other stuff. At this time period, we're talking early 20th century, some of this is like before World War I, even like early 20th century. And even then, you see the white woman leading the charge. You're not going to dump all that stuff here. Get on out of here. And getting rules and protections in place to safeguard. I thought that was hugely important. And the distinct difference where she, in the book, she uses the term ethnic whites. She uses different terms throughout the text, but ethnic whites, just that stark contrast. You do have a hierarchy in the system of racism, white supremacy, and not being, but Dr. Was it black? Get back. Hugely important because it would not just be W.E.B. Du Bois and their, or I guess you can look at it this way, since we talked about it last week and one of our listeners wrote in and said as well about the way that she, what word will I choose, critiqued some of the victims of racism and their response to this chemical and biological warfare pollution, talking about her responses about or critiques of Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, Dr. King last week. I think she said that they were impotent and their responses or lack thereof have kind of set the tone or the pattern for how black people have responded in an impotent manner over a few generations. If you contrast their efforts against Mary McDowell, someone who is not black, and just how she's going to be treated, what she can get accomplished, and going out and rallying and speaking to these different groups and what have you, very, very different. And I think that's important because she gets a lot of attention. She even goes on next week and continuing to talk about the exploits and accomplishments of Mary McDowell in Chicago. Not saying that that should be downplayed, just it is substantially different the way so-called ethnic whites, anybody really who is not classified and treated as a Negro, the way that you're going to be treated. Imagine if Greta Thunberg, if she looked like, Lupita Nyong'o. Real different situation. I don't think she'd be hanging out on Democracy Now! All the time. Everybody would know her name. And that's right, environmental, you've got to do something about I don't think, maybe I'm, in error. Folks still processing, getting their thoughts together for the second audio segment.
Can I be heard?
Retired firefighter.
Yes, as I was listening about this very horrendous environment, and primarily they're using the term I just forgot what it was. These newer versions of white people. What was that term they kept identifying as?
Ethnic whites.
Ethnic whites. Polish to be exact. It would be my guess that the environment where they were recruited from was worse. That was a motivation to be able to recruit them effectively with the idea in mind that their conditions would improve somewhat over just a short generation. I have a question, and maybe Mr. Henry from Chicago can answer the question. Are these the same ethnic white people who by the 1960s was so viciously viral in their unwant to have black people staying next to them when Dr. King came to the Chicago area. I believe it was around Hyde Park area or something like that. And it was so horrendous to Dr. King that he said that it was far worse than the racial climate, the racial behavior by whites in the South. It was so bad by these same people. I'm just thinking because I believe they were, quote unquote, Polish white people from Poland. I could be wrong. Maybe Mr. Henry can help me / help us with that distinction.
Much obliged, retired firefighter. Other folks who are with us, appreciate the question. I believe some of those whites that Cicero, that's the area specifically, or one of the areas in Chicago that he went to do some protesting, and I think some of those folks were classified as being ethnic whites, or these are.
He got hit upside the head with a rock, with a brick.
Yes.
Dr. King did.
Yes.
In that park.
I think that was some of the justification that these folks just migrated here and they worked so hard to get their houses, and they're just not going to have their property values ruined by a few upstart Negroes, even if it is Dr. King. I think that was a lot of the justification that was used for the rocks being thrown upside Dr. King's skull. And it was really bad. I got a lot of video footage by 60s. You know, a lot of this is on YouTube now. Other folks who dialed in have Thomas in New York.
Yes, sir. Yeah, a lot of times when they talk Polish, especially if it's before the 1940s, it's a nice way of saying Jewish. Carbon reduction, that's a fancy environmental term that means too many non-white people. We need to do something about it. We need some carbon reduction. Too much melanin, which is carbon. Bubbly Creek. These white people, boy, they can reverse the river. They reverse the flow of the river to have the sewage flow the other way. Like, you just talk about, just amazing. Bubbly Creek bubbled and continued. They continued to dump waste even though it didn't work, changing the flow of the river. When I went to Chicago, I went with my cousin who's a lot older than me, and her nephew who's my cousin, but he's my age. And we were both 17, and we stayed with her best friend when she lived in Chicago, my cousin, who happened to be a white woman named Barbara. And Barbara just happened to be the vice president of the Bank of Chicago. So she lived in a nice high-rise building with a pool and exercise room. She took us around to all the stores and told the white people, this is Thomas and this is, Brandon, and they're going to be staying with me. So, they're safe. I guess, these are my niggers. But either way, they had this soda called Green River at this store. And me and my cousin, we would go to this store 2-3 times a day to get this soda, because we never tasted it before, and it was like a better tasting Mountain Dew. And it was delicious. We go back, and, we were really bored, so we didn't have too much to do. So either way, she told us the story. Oh, they dyed a river green for St. Patrick's Day. And I said, really? And she was like, yeah. And she showed pictures of it, and it was like, wow, so that's that same river, the Bubbly Creek. Just, white people. Gentrification, the gentleman spoke about it earlier. The whites destroy these large urban areas with their chemicals from industrialization and all that. Then the government places the white people in the suburbs, and the blacks move into these contaminated places. And they do nothing about it for years. And over that period, blacks buy property in those places and rent, put a lot of money and resources into those areas that they have. And all of a sudden, you know, they also say, hey, you're not allowed to live in these other areas, you know, so you got to stay here in this contaminated area. And all of a sudden, whites decide one day they want to spend money and clean this area up. And I saw it, you know, lived it. And it wasn't cleaned up for us. It was cleaned up for their grandchildren to come back and gentrify those areas that we live in, because we have no, like you say, Gus, community. 50, 60 years later, it's like, it was almost like they had it all planned out. Listen, 50 years, this is all going to be cleaned up. You know, it's just going to take some time. Sell your house to a higher rate to them niggas. They'll live here. 50 years, come back. We'll set it up so you can come right back and, you know, your grandkids could get these properties. And that's just what they did. As for the ethnic whites, you know, these people came from squalor and unsanitary conditions. The bubonic plague to Ellis Allen. If you look at The Godfather, I know that's one of Mr. Fuller's favorite movies. They show how contaminated these people were when they came to Ellis Allen, the ethnic whites. You know, and I think they earned their white stripes when I think the firefighter was just talking about Cicero and Dr. King went there. I mean, it showed the white people down south, you know, these are Irish and Polish and Italians ain't that bad. Last week's reading, this is the last thing, Gus, the Chinese people. And I liked how the reader, the writer put this. This is one of my notes from last week. I didn't say, but they cleaned their clothes and you know, put on some clean clothes. They're full of disease, but when they put on some clean clothes, they can serve them food. They can go cook their food, clean their clothes for them. Just put on a white apron and a hat, and you're good to go. And it's just like slavery. That's what I equated it to. These contaminated niggas in the field, but they could come in the house. Just put them on a nice, clean shirt. They could serve us. You know, we could go down in the yard and have some sex with them. But they're still these animals. You know what I'm saying? That's just how whites think. And I make my line. Thank you, Gus.
Much obliged, Thomas in New York. One of our investors wrote in for this week, number one, the section on environmental justice, on the environmental justice movement, provided evidence of the activism of black people in America regarding these issues. It brought to mind the hit song of Marvin Gaye of 1971, Mercy, Mercy Me, the ecology. The late. The author also provided analysis that the white environmental activists were more interested in ecocentric policy, environment without man, as opposed to addressing the basic needs for survival in an indifferent or hostile human environment. In other words, they were more interested in saving trees as opposed to helping black people. Number two, the differential governmental response to the Love Canal 1978 incident relocating residents as opposed to the initial response to the protests of black people of Warren County, North Carolina was characteristic of the system of white supremacy. It was also ironic that the Burns Ward Company transported waste from Buffalo in the vicinity of the Love Canal to Warren County, North Carolina in 1978. The eventual attempt at mitigation of the environmental hazard in Warren County, North Carolina occurred 20 years after the contamination. Was it too little too late? Probably. Number three, the reversal of the Chicago River. That stood out to a lot of people. In order to stave off pollution of Lake Michigan, exemplified to me the power, he didn't say privilege, the power and scientific precision of racist man. The goal was to protect the more powerful racists. The concentration of pollutants in Bubbly Creek produced the greatest harm to those immigrants living in the back of the yards, particularly Eastern Europeans, Poles, ones who were the greatest in number and lower on the ethnic hierarchical scale compared to those of Irish and German descent. Another example of white sacrifice. This section was very informative and thought-provoking. Most of it has been. Reversing the flow of the water. So that's what I mean about being scientific. We're not just going to come out and this is our list of demands. You crackers had better do everything that we say. Blah, blah, blah. We don't even come out with all that. We just go about the business. Like I said, they probably didn't come out, with a lot of hoopla and we're going to do reversal of the Ritter, blah, blah, blah. It might be something in the paper or what have you, but I mean, we just go quietly about the business. This one is going to happen. And, the date might be probably you just come out on Friday, March 13, 8 a.m. Set your clocks, be up early when the sun is up because the river will be reversed. That's having a scientific plan, not just we got our list of demands. Now, how are we going to bring this about? Open for suggestions. No. Racist man, racist woman, racist child. Scientific in their approach to practicing racism, even sometimes to polluting the river. They can be scientific about it. Incidentally, that Green River has come up before in the program, and they allege that is all environmental friendly. They do dump a lot of chemicals in the river, and I think it stays green for some time, like more than just that day. Or I guess that's all coming up, so we can look, I guess, next week. And we can see when they flip the river. That'll be for next week's book study, perhaps. We can see when they dye the river, and we can see how long it lasts. But I think it's more than a day. But they say it's all, biodegradable and doesn't harm anything and doesn't leave a trace and it's all organic and all the rest of it. I would just say, the time and energy for a day that is mostly centered around binge drinking, because it's not just the river is green, the beer is green, and we got to hit the tavern and do some drinking after we do the parade and all that. For a day that's largely around drinking, that's what I've seen. Really? That's what we need? We can't even get clean water. We got to struggle and fight to get clean water, and just for one day, time and energy to make the water green. Urugu, we read it, Dr. Marimba Ani. Other folks have observations, thoughts that they wanted to share.
Can I be heard?
Henry in Chicago, our dutiful narrator.
Yes, I believe what the retired firefighter was asking earlier, I wasn't able to get on at the time, was when Dr. King's visit, were the residents where he visited were the immigrant whites. And I will say this, that when Dr. King visited Marquette Park, I know the area of Marquette Park had Lithuanians, but at the time he was there, I'm not sure if they were still there. I think there were Anglo whites. But I do know with the area of Cicero, those were primarily Italians over there. So yeah, they were the quote-unquote ethnic whites in Cicero. So that's about as clear as I can remember. But one thing you were just referring to, the dyeing of the Chicago River in St. Patrick's Day. I would say one of the redeemable things about this corona pandemic that is happening is that the St. Patrick's Day parade has been canceled. So there will be no St. Patrick's Day parade in Chicago, not one in the downtown area and not one on the south side, which they have two every year. So there will be no St. Patrick's Day parade this year. Hallelujah. Thank God. I'll mute my line.
Stunning. Absolutely stunning. I have to see now. See, if it's about public gatherings, well, then, man, maybe we won't have a green beer after all. The tavern might be impacted. Might have to go to the grocery store and get a little green dye and do it yourself at home. My goodness. I don't know if that will impact the river being green or not if they're not going to have a parade. Wow. Corona, no good. Wuhan, contaminated. That's why you got to quarantine them, see? That yellow peril, see? Any century. No good slant-eyed yellow folks always causing problems for us. That's why you quarantine 4 more years, man. You got to be careful about that thing, man. Other folks got problems, questions that they want to make sure they get in pertaining to the book, Packing Them In, Dr. Sylvia Hood, Washington.
I can, Gus. I think that they canceled St. Patrick's Day parade here, and I think I said on the show before, there's a few things that are more deplorable than seeing that, stuff they get away with. But that's all I had to say. Great book, Gus.
Much obliged. We're still plugging through. We'll be here next week. Dr. Sylvia Hood Washington packing them in. Quite interesting. Again, if you live in the Chicago area, if you grew up there maybe, or you have resided there, you have connections to that area, a book you should probably have in the library. Important. Test your water. Especially if you have children, offspring, or planning to have children. Test your water. Do some checking on water filters. Get something, whatever option you think will work best. If it's a picture or something, that you can attach to the plumbing at the actual residence. But check your water. Maybe even get one of those strips where you can check the air quality, although they have a lot of different apps and information that'll give you updates on the air quality in your area. But your air quality as well. I know I have a HEPA air filter at my spot. And some of the other parents that I know in particular, they have HEPA air filters. That was talked about in A Terrible Thing to Waste, Harriet A. Washington, last book we read. So very important. Take your health seriously. There's so many toxins. You just try to do the best you can to minimize. Again, a lot of the toxins that we heard about in the second portion of the reading this week, the beef industry, the meat industry, industrialized food complex, and having to slaughter all these animals so that everybody can have their chicken nuggets and slab of bacon and all the rest of it. Plant-based yoga retreat. Think of the poor folk. Think of Scotty Reed, rest of the black people in North Carolina suffering because of bacon. Ham hocks, chitlins, porky. Plant-based yoga retreat, all the meals. I posted the photographs. You can look on the Facebook page. The cauliflower fried chicken. We've had that at every yoga retreat. Every single one. Chef Nadira has done it repeatedly. I'm looking forward to doing my take on it. You can see some of the photos on the Facebook page. You can eat well, use logic, not have to create all the environmental pollution, slaughtering animals. But yes, the plant-based yoga retreat. Sold out for Toronto this spring, but we will be in Washington, D.C. This summer, August 5th through the 9th. Much obliged for everyone's participation. Hope it was worthy of your Thursday evening. Sobriety would be best under conditions of white supremacy racism. Harriet A. Washington, book we just read, she mentioned alcohol, noxious alcohol. That is a part of the brain damage, environmental racism of this system. Protect that brain computer. In addition to being sober, let's be buckled up every time we are in a vehicle. Passenger or driver, if you are behind the wheel, you are sober, buckled, not on the cell phone, just doing all the little things that we can to keep ourselves as safe as possible under conditions of extreme danger. With that, Creator, we ask that you help us remain patient with other black people, victims of white supremacy. We ask that you help us remain patient with ourselves. Remind us to demonstrate the highest levels of black self-respect at all times, in all places, each and every time we are in contact with another black person. It has been time. Replace white supremacy with justice immediately. Cow signing out. Thanks all for tuning in.